Hello, AP students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 9, Psychological Development. And we're going to take a look at Part 3, and we're going to look at basically the neonatal development and the development of infants. So, the neonatal period of the newborn child is basically this time frame from birth to the end of the first month. And during this period of time, our little ones are really experiencing the world through all of their senses. The sense of taste is definitely one that shows a preference towards things that are sweet and salty. Babies who are nursing have a tendency to respond better to certain foods that have a certain amount of sweetness to them. Along with that, babies will smell, and certain smells might bring on a reaction of a smile. And they have found that the smell of bananas, for some reason, kind of makes babies smile a little bit. Along with that, with vision, newborn babies are incredibly nearsighted. For the most part, they can only see about 12 inches in front of them. They can detect the contours at close distances. And a lot of times that means that when we talk about the newborns, they are probably most likely to want to be held so that they can be looked at and they can look at you. And that distance between being, cradled in a parent's arms is about 12 inches. They are quite interested in patterns on shirts and maybe in some cases on blankets. By the time they're roughly 3 months old, then we can start talking about a little bit of depth perception, distance vision, so they can see things a little further away, but it takes a little bit of time. Sound, for infants, the preference is for the human voice over other sounds, greater preference for female voices opposed to male voices. There's a tendency, regardless of male or female, but when people are around newborn babies, it's amazing how the tone of their voice or the pitch of their voice kind of goes up. And in a way that might be to mimic female voices. The postural reflex. This is kind of a unique reflex, and if you take a look at the center picture here, this allows for babies to sit with some support. There is a tendency that if you hold on to the baby's hands or fingers, that they have a tendency to want to pull themselves up. And that is what that reflex is. Pretty much all newborns have this, and it is quite amazing to look at it. The grasping reflex. This is the ability for our newborns to grab a hold of a finger and to cling on to it very tightly, to the point that, if you want to combine these two reflexes, that you could pull the baby from, maybe a lying position into that sitting position just by these two. All right, infancy. This is the time period from the end of the neonatal period until the establishment of language. And so that might mean, depending on the individual, anywhere between 18 months to maybe 2 years or 24 months. We have a tendency to think that infancy, for the most part, ends upon an individual's first birthday. And truth is, it may go on a little bit longer than we give it credit. But for the first few years of life, the brain circuits are not fully connected, and hence we have poor memory for any kind of event that happens before age 3.5. And in some cases, maybe beyond that, maybe poor memory for things that happen in the first 5 years of life. But during infancy, the brain shifts from producing new cells to the growth and connections of the dendrites and the axons. So in other words, we have all these wonderful new neurons, but we're going to start building the connections to these neurons, and we're going to start developing some pathways. The total mass of the neurotissue increases roughly 50% in the first 2 years, and by the age of 4, it will have doubled from its size at birth. The connections that are not used are lost through a process known as synaptic pruning. And this is when our unused neurons are returned to an uncommitted state for future use. So, taking a look at the graphic here, if you take a look at some of the neurons that are here, you can see at 36 weeks of gestation, this is roughly 4 weeks before a baby is born, or roughly 8 months into a pregnancy. You can see a few of those neurons. And if you look further, the connections for newborns, a little further connections for our newborn infant around 3 months. And by the time we go from 3 months to 6 years, we have all these wonderful connections happening. 2 years of age, lots of connections. But it's between ages 2 and upwards to about age 6 that we go through a process of pruning out. And if you've done any gardening in your life, you know that sometimes pruning is a way to establish stronger connections. And so our brain does this automatically. We also do it again when we hit adolescence. And that's kind of an unusual period of time when you can have an individual when they start entering puberty, maybe around age 12 or 13, that they might become a little more clumsy, maybe a little more absent-minded. And part of that might be because of the synaptic pruning that's happening again at that point in our lives. All right, infancy, learning and social abilities. Infants build up their knowledge of the world by observing relations between the important sensory events. And this is getting into kind of talking about concepts of classical conditioning, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we kind of go through a few more chapters here. Infants quickly learn to distinguish their mother's voice, and they learn to associate their caregiver with other certain odors. So there's been a lot of research that infants and mothers can identify each other within a few hours after birth. Um, what's interesting is individuals who are caregivers, be it males or females, have an ability to distinguish their baby just by the smell. Babies can manipulate their parents by cooing and smiling and crying. Uh, Learning and memory underlie a lot of abilities of newborns, for the most part, to imitate simple facial expressions such as sticking out the tongue or rounding the mouth. So if you take a look at the series of photos here over here to the right, you have an adult that's sticking their tongue out. Our very small infants will study the face and they will imitate that. If you open your mouth like you're going to yawn and you're looking at baby, baby may yawn. If you kind of pucker up your lips, they may do the same thing. So if you ever have an opportunity to be around a fairly young infant, you might give that a shot because it's very entertaining. Synchronicity, this is the close coordination between the gazing, vocalizing, touching, and smiling of mothers and infants. It's that bonding, if you want to talk about it. But babies respond and learn. They send out messages to those willing to listen and to love them. Synchronicity is one of those beautiful things that comes with parenthood. Infancy, when we talk about attachment, attachment is the enduring social and emotional relationship between a child and a parent or other caregiver, and bonding is the foundation of all other relationships. Certain animals have an ability to bond in a way that's different than maybe humans, and that is in the form of imprinting. It's a primitive form of learning in which some animals learn to follow and form attachments to the first moving thing that they see or hear. Typically, you see this like within birds. So you have a mother duck and her little ducklings are following her. But let's say another animal enters the picture, like our dog here. It's possible that these little babies will bond with the dog or at least form an attachment. Babies will form attachments to any individual who consistently and appropriately responds to their needs. And that last blank there should be a respond. But one man who's spent a lot of time studying attachment was a man named Conrad Lorenz. And the black boots that he's wearing as he's going out to deal with his gooselings or goslings, he would wear those, and the birds, for the most part, formed an attachment to anyone who was wearing those same boots. So, yeah, Lorenz said a lot about the whole notion of attachment. All right, we'll clear off that last blank. Respond. All right, moving ahead. Infancy in stranger situations. Mary Ainsworth, she spent her career studying the various forms of attachment. She did this by observing young children in a variety of different stranger situations. And so she talked a little bit about the notion of how children are bonded, and she talked about the securely attached child. This is a child who felt close to their mother, safe, and more willing to explore or tolerate a new experience. So this securely attached child might play nearby mom, might wander over by mom, check in with her, and then wander away and do different things. You might also have the insecurely attached child who is likely to react to a stranger situation with either anxiety or ambivalence or avoidance. And so they may be very clingy to their mother or father. They might, demand contact. They might cry with fear, and you can tell the pitch of the cry is more shrill. They might get angry when they're separated. They're difficult to console when they're in this state. You may have the child who does not react to when the parent or the caregiver comes into the room, and so they're more avoidant. So these are things that maybe Ainsworth noticed with children who had some issues here. Anyway, Ainsworth concluded that attachment patterns established in infancy may persist well into adulthood. And so if you had a child who was insecurely attached, they may have problems as far as attaching to other people or acceptance and things of that nature. Anyway, individuals who lack healthy attachments in infancy and childhood are not necessarily doomed for failure in life, but these problems are a good predictor of later problems with social relationships. All right, so looking at this chart here, and we've got another one we're going to take a look at. About 70% of the children that she looked at were securely attached, or what she would call their type B. Children were given positive working models. Caregiver who was emotionally available, sensitive, and supporting are avoidant. These are children that have a working model for themselves as unacceptable and unworthy. The caregiver could be rejecting. Or you could have a resistant, a child has a negative self-image, an exaggerated emotional response to gain attention. And part of that might be is that their caregiver is inconsistent as far as giving support. So anyway, looking at these again, secure, quick to react, quick to respond. Child might distress when the caregiver leaves, but will quickly become happy and seek comfort and kind of get over it. The insecure, avoidant, they're unresponsive, uncaring, dismissive, no distress when their caregiver leaves, but at the same time, they don't acknowledge the return of the caregiver, and they do not seek to make contact with the caregiver. The insecure, ambivalent, responds to a child inconsistently. There's distress when the caregiver leaves. They're not comforted by the return of the caregiver, so they're still having issues. The insecure, disorganized, abusive, or neglectful caregiver behaviors responds in frightening ways or frightened ways, and there is no attaching behaviors. Often appear dazed, confused, apprehensive in the presence of the caregiver as far as how the child would behave. Infancy contact comfort. Why do infants become attached to caregivers? Well, you got to talk about the Harlows and their research. An evolutionary explanation says that attachment safeguards an infant's survival by assuring the support and protection that it requires. This idea has been dubbed as the cupboard theory. Infants become attached to those who provide the cupboard or food. Orphans that may have a lack of touch might display affection or other displays of affection, led research to doubt the cupboard theory. So this is where we get into the research of Harry Harlow and his wife, Margaret Harlow. They tested this idea against the cupboard theory and devised an experiment which showed the power of contact comfort. And contact comfort is basically the stimulation and resurgence derived from physical touch of the caregiver. And you might remember hearing about this maybe in sociology, but they had basically two surrogate mothers. One was a terry cloth towel with the head on it, and the other was a wire mesh, but it had milk so that the little monkey could nurse. And what they found is that the monkeys tended to go to the terry cloth mama because it was soft and comforting. So the lack of close, loving relationships in infancy even affects physical growth. Children are emotionally detached, will grow slower, and have a failure to thrive. In other words, when you look at things like the body mass index, they have a tendency to score lower on those numbers. Maturation and physical growth. When we talk about maturation or maturing, this is the process by which genetic program manifests itself over time. Sitting, crawling, walking all occur on their own biological time schedules. So one child might begin to sit at maybe 3 or 4 months of age. Another, it might be at age or at 6 months of age. It may vary. A child learns to walk without special training, following a time-ordered pattern. Typically, you have to go through the process of sitting, crawling, walking before you can ever get close to the process of running. So you got to follow a certain order. The environment influences, such as the vigorous massages that are given by some mothers to their infant babies in the West Indies. These infants receive a daily massage, and that leads to earlier than on time schedules when it comes to sitting independently and walking. So maybe, giving your baby a massage might be a good idea. And we have seen some psychologists kind of advocating for that even in the modern day and age. Human physical growth has traditionally been seen as a continuous process whose rate changes as age slowing over time, but growth in length of the infant's body occurs in a discontinuous birth, sometimes called saltation. To the right here, you might see a similar body mass index or the height weight scale. This is typically used to determine whether or not a child is growing at the proper rate. And usually parents will hear that their child is at a certain percentile for height and weight when they go and see their doctors. Thank you very much.